Okay, so we're going to get started. Again, this is Mike Ferguson with Baker Hostetler. Welcome to another in a series of our policy webinars from Baker Hostetler's federal policy team. I lead Baker's federal policy team here in Washington. We provide clients with comprehensive government affairs and public policy consulting services. I'm joined today by my colleague and friend at Baker Hostetler here, Heath Schuler. He's a senior advisor in our federal policy team practice group as well. Heath was also my colleague when we served together in the House of Representatives. I was elected as a Republican from New Jersey. Heath was a Democrat elected from North Carolina. So while there's not too much bipartisanship on Capitol Hill these days, we are going to put together a bipartisan perspective for you all today on what happened on Election Day last night and what it means moving forward. Heath, good afternoon. Thanks for being on the presentation with us today.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for everybody participating in the webinar.
All right. So today we're going to talk about what the midterm elections mean for policy and legislative activity next year in 2019. We'll touch briefly also on what it may look like for a lame duck session here before the end of the year. But before that, let's do a quick overview on what happened last night and where things stand. There are still several House and Senate races that are too close to call. Some may go to recounts. So there will be a Senate runoff election next month in Mississippi. But as of now, Democrats will be in the House majority in 2019, next year. The Democrats needed to win 23 net seats to capture the majority, and as of earlier today, Democrats had won 27, so more than they needed to be in control of the House of Representatives next year. Of the races that are left that are too close to call, there are 21 or so of those races that are too close to call at this point. Republicans lead in 13 of those. Democrats currently lead in 8 of those. And again, that was as of earlier today. So some of these races are being called for one candidate or another, as we speak, and they will continue to do that over the course of today and the coming days. Some of these may take a week or two or more. But in the Senate, Republicans actually added to their narrow majority. They picked up at least 2 net seats, leaving they really leveraged a historically favorable map this year while weathering a challenging political environment overall. Republicans needed to defeat senators in some of the key states that President Trump had won a couple of years ago, and they did that in some states. Republicans defeated Democratic incumbent senators in Indiana, in North Dakota, and in Missouri. And Republican candidates also lead very narrowly right now in Arizona, which had been a Republican-held seat, and in Florida, which has been a Democratic-held seat. So both of those races are too close to call at this point. Senator Jon Tester seems to have narrowly won his reelection in Montana, Democratic senator in Montana, and Dean Heller, a Republican senator in Nevada, seems to has lost his reelection. So the very narrow Republican leads right now in the Arizona and Florida, if those hold, Republicans will have gained a net of 3 seats, and they'll have a majority of 54 seats in 2019 in the next Congress. So Heath, we're going to get into some of the specifics, but overall, what are some of your top line impressions of what happened? We had sort of in some ways, I guess, a split decision with Republicans picking up seats in the Senate and Democrats winning control of the House.
Well, certainly a very interesting evening last night, and I might add early, Mike, you actually I think you're going to hit it right perfect on the number of seats that both the Senates would pick up in the Senate and the number of seats that Democrats would pick up in the House. I think you're going to be right. I think you picked 33 seats. Looks like that may be the right answer, and it could be 2 or 3 seats there in the Senate. So you actually studied this extremely well and got it. I was a little more pessimistic and for the Democrats going forward, and certainly it felt like deja vu of 16 all over again when I saw the early votes had come in Florida and how things were transitioning. And then I talked to my friend, Senator Joe Donnelly, and he was saying things were not looking good in Indiana. And so it seemed to me that that there was so much of the the Trump supporters that were coming out in Florida and some of these red states that he certainly had organized and they had done a very strong job in some of these states of getting the Republicans back to the polls, where it had seemed prior to the late summer that the Democrats were going to take an even larger sweep. So I think there's a lot to be said about how the president's actually gone around the country and actually campaigned in some of these states. It certainly paid off for some of the candidates. But very interesting night. I think there was five governors who won in states that that Trump had won in 2016. So there was a little bit of change in some of these states as well. So I think so much of this is going to just over the next couple of years is really just looking to the 2020 election. You hate to think that, but it's 2 years away, and the presidential election starts relatively soon. And with having the Congress being split, it's going to be quite entertaining, to say the least, at times.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting. You mentioned the governor's races. The Republicans going into this election cycle had probably a historically high number of governorships that they held, so they had a lot to defend. They had elected successfully a lot of governors in the election 4 years ago, so a lot of these folks were up for re-election or perhaps were term limited but were Republican open seats. And Democrats certainly won some of those back, some of those governorships, but it was interesting that some of the key competitive governor's races that Republicans were able to hold on to were in Florida, it seems, and in Ohio and in Iowa, which are really key states as you're heading into a presidential cycle, as you're talking about in 2020. Having Republican governors and their Republican machinery in control of state government in those states will be very important on the Republican side of the aisle. And then also, interestingly, in a couple of pretty blue states, in Maryland and in Massachusetts, you had Republican governors who were reelected in both of those pretty Democratic states. But again, I think those were probably had a little bit more to do with the individual popularity, personal popularity of those two governors, Governor Baker in Massachusetts and Governor Larry Hogan in Maryland. So they'll be important. Governorships will be important going into the presidential election cycle, but also these are the governors that were elected yesterday in many of these states are going to be the governors who will preside over redistricting, which will be hugely important for future control of the House of Representatives as well. Republicans did really well in that process, the last time around, almost 10 years ago. And so it'll be interesting to see how this election here in 2018 is going to impact redistricting in 2021 and beyond. So that's going to be pretty pretty interesting to see how that pans out. So now that the elections are mostly over, we have some recounts and some races that are still outstanding, as we've talked about. But coming up later this month, Republicans and Democrats are going to be getting together in Washington to have their leadership elections to figure out who are going to be leading the Democrats in the House and the Republicans in the House in particular. And both sides have their front runners right now, but it's not 100% certain. You have, certainly starting last night, you had a lot of Republicans and Democrats on the phone talking to their colleagues and future colleagues, trying to round up votes for leadership elections. Heath, let's talk about the Democrats first, since they are going to be in charge. Nancy Pelosi, of course, is the current leader of the Democrats in the House. Does she have it locked up? Is she going to be the next speaker?
Well, you can never count her out. There's probably not a harder worker in all of Washington, D.C., and a better politician than Nancy Pelosi when it comes to getting votes. That being said, there's a lot of new members, and it's kind of amazing. There was some 44 candidates who ran that basically said they would not support her or did not have any intention of supporting her as speaker. And I think these last 5 or 6 races or 10 races that are up for grabs right now could really mean the difference between whether or not she can get enough votes on the House floor. I think she wins the vote because it's only, it's 50% plus 1 in the caucus. So essentially it would be just Democrats voting for a speaker, and then they move from the speakership to the House floor. And at that point in time, a lot could change. And so the way I look at it is there going to be a lot of politics and a lot of moving parts going on, especially when it comes to committee assignments between now and the election of the speaker within the Democratic caucus. And if you look at it, then Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn both are there, and it looks like Steny would obviously be the majority leader, and then Jim Clyburn would be the whip. So a little early to tell yet until the members get in and who is willing to kind of take Nancy Pelosi on as a front runner for that speakership position.
Yeah, you mentioned, Heath, some of the candidates out there who, as part of their campaigns, said that they would not vote for Nancy Pelosi for speaker or for Democratic, head of the party, or and you can never quite tell what the details were of those pledges or those promises by some of those candidates. Did that mean they weren't going to vote for her in the Democratic caucus to be their speaker candidate, or did that mean they would not vote for her on the floor at the first day of the new Congress in January? And it will be particularly interesting because it looks like the Democrats will have a majority of anywhere from 10 to 15 seats maybe. So that's not, historically speaking, that's a very small margin. And if you've got, Republicans who had to deal with this for the last few election cycles, if you have even a small group of your own members who either don't want to or have pledged not to vote for, say, in this case, Pelosi for speaker, what kind of deals might she have to cut, or how might that throw those elections, those leadership elections off? So it's going to be interesting to watch, certainly. But that is as they say in the business, a high quality problem to have to deal with. I'm sure Nancy Pelosi is very pleased today to have to deal with that issue. On the other side of the aisle, the Republicans, they're licking their wounds a little bit. Obviously, they've been thrown out of power. And there are also some questions about the top spot. Of course, Speaker Ryan retired from Congress. So there's an open contest for leadership positions there. I think most folks anticipate that Kevin McCarthy will become the now minority leader, or Republican leader. And Steve Scalise, currently the number 3, would kind of bump up to the number 2 as the whip. But there certainly is going to be, we already have some declared candidates for the number 3 position in the House Republican leadership. And currently, Cathy McMorris Rodgers, who was reelected in a hard-fought race in Washington State, she's the current number 3 in the leadership, and I'm sure wants to stay as the Republican conference chair. Liz Cheney from Wyoming has also announced that she is going to run for that position and challenge Cathy McMorris Rodgers. And you never know if Patrick McHenry, who's currently the chief deputy whip, may want to sort of move into that elected leadership as well. I should also mention, of course, that while most folks anticipate that Kevin McCarthy is going to move up to that number 1 position amongst House Republicans, Jim Jordan, congressman from Ohio, has also declared that he is going to run for Republican leader in the House. And he'll have some very strong backing from some of those more conservative members of the Republican conference. My estimation, though, is he's not going to end up having the votes to topple Kevin McCarthy, but it is a secret ballot, and you never know what might happen on issues like that. Looking at additional personnel changes, we're going to, obviously, with the change in leadership of the House from Republican to Democrat, we're going to have new chairs of some really important committees of jurisdiction. So let's take a look at those. Democrats are going to take over chairmanships of each of the House committees, and some of the key committees we'll talk about briefly. And Heath, what can you tell us about some of these new members, Democratic members, who are going to be taking over as chairman of some of these key committees? Richie Neal from Massachusetts going to take over the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the Tax Writing Committee. He's been he's a relatively lower profile guy. You don't see him on TV all the time, but I know him personally. I know you know him. He's got a good reputation. But how do you think that's going to go with Richie Neal as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee?
Well, I think actually Richie from both sides of the aisle understands that he is he's a guy that actually can negotiate. You can have a conversation with. You can view your differences and opinions with him. He doesn't hold it personally. He understands everybody's districts. At the Democratic Party when I served, it was a pretty broad differences between the Blue Dog members that I represented and the left wing of the party. So he was always able to negotiate and navigate through that, and always seemed to have a really good rapport with the Republicans as well. So he's had that chairmanship before, so I don't think it'll be nothing unusual. I think that there'll be opportunity for discussion, and I really think that he's probably one of the better fits for that position. Frank Pallone with Energy and Commerce. Frank tends to be a little more hardcore, a little bit more leaning left. Same thing with Jerry Nadler. Jerry, he always has. He's very outspoken. He's very boisterous within the caucus, and he typically is not one to have negotiating skills with the Republican Party. He typically is pretty straightforward, pretty left wing on his viewpoint. So that'll be interesting in the Judiciary Committee how Jerry Nadler actually brings that his style to the chairmanship there. And then Elijah Cummings, I think this is where a lot of the noise and a lot of the games will be played in 19 and 20 when it comes to Oversight Committee. Elijah Cummings, well respected, kind of a fireball as a chairman. He's a really tough, no nonsense chairman. Gets his committee in line pretty quickly. Gets a lot of respect from both the House and the Republican members, but that'll be the committee that I think we'll look at over the next couple of years with investigations and oversight. And one of the things that Nancy Pelosi said in her interview earlier today is part of her constitutional and members of the House's constitutional responsibility is government oversight. So I think that just is a preview of investigations going on with the president. So it'll be real interesting. I don't think there are going to be any changes in those four. I would be surprised. The only way those changes could happen if there were new leadership at the forefront with the speaker and the leader.
Yeah, I agree. Those are good summaries of these different folks who will be taking over these key committees. Frank Pallone, of course, from my home state of New Jersey, longtime member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and very, very excited, I know, to become the chairman of that committee, as he's worked in the trenches on the issues on the Energy and Commerce Committee for a long, long time. Jerry Nadler, of course, I can say this because I'm from the neighborhood, he is a tough New Yorker. And I know he and Elijah Cummings are chomping at the bit to get going with their investigations and oversight of the Trump administration. I know that's something that they've talked about, and I think they're gearing up. They're hiring staff and investigators and attorneys, and looking forward to, I think, very aggressively, I think, playing that oversight and investigation role. So, bear down for all of that, as you say. Let's look over at the Senate for a second. There'll be some interesting changes going on over in the Senate, even though there's not a change in leadership. They'll see some changes because the number 2 Republican Senator, John Cornyn, who's the Senate Majority Whip right now, he's term limited in that position. So it's expected that the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, John Thune from South Dakota, is going to succeed Cornyn as the Majority Whip, which would allow Roger Wicker, who's the Republican senator from Mississippi, likely to become the next chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. So that will be interesting. It's also, I think, likely that Senator Chuck Grassley will take over the all-important Senate Finance Committee after the retirement of Orrin Hatch, longtime Republican senator from Utah, who's retiring now, and Chuck Grassley will likely have to relinquish the chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee in order to take the chairmanship of the Senate Finance Committee. And of course, the Judiciary Committee is going to play a big role in confirming President Trump's judicial appointments and other appointments. So it's if Grassley does leave the Judiciary Committee, then Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina would be next in line to lead the Senate Judiciary Committee. So So even though no change in control of the Senate, it'll be interesting to see how, with Republicans picking up a couple of seats, gives them a little bit more breathing room to confirm some nominees. We saw how close and how difficult the fight was over some of the Supreme Court nominations. Now picking up at least 2, maybe 3 seats could give a little bit more breathing room for some of these new chairmen of these committees and for Leader McConnell to move some of these nominations through the Senate. Heath, any thoughts on those?
No, Mike, I think that's really good. Great explanation of those senators. I might add that Roger Wicker is one of those members that has always been able to extend a hand across the aisle. Very well respected in the Senate. Lindsey Graham is what you see is what you got, what you get with Lindsey. One day, he may support the president. Next day, he may be opposing the president, and he seems he's obviously always in the news and always got an opinion, but well respected because he sticks with what his beliefs are, and the people in the state of South Carolina really respect Lindsey Graham.
So let's circle back now to the House. The Democrats taking over the House and their agenda. Heath, I'm going to ask you to talk to us a little bit about the better deal agenda that Nancy Pelosi and Democrats had laid out as part of the campaign, as saying what they wanted to do. As a reminder to our listeners, I'm just going to remind folks again, if you have questions about election results or a question about how the elections may impact public policy next year, you can use the box on the bottom of your screen to submit questions. And we'll try to get to as many of those at the end as we can. So Heath, we've got the better deal up on the screen now. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this is the platform that the Democrats ran on all election cycles. You started looking around, each state seemed to be a little bit different, which is an issue that they may be facing within their states, but primarily the healthcare was always lowering the healthcare costs and prescription drugs. The prescription drug cost is an area that I would say that the Democratic leadership and the president actually probably would agree on. So I think that's one area that of probably stress for the pharmaceutical industry and how they're going to deal with the possibility of getting something done and lowering the prescription drug prices. Healthcare costs overall, I think that'll be a very difficult task, very daunting task. It's tried time and time again. I just don't see another healthcare bill going forward anytime soon. I think that's a very the Democrats would like to do it, but it's probably an issue that they'd like to run on in 2020. The economy part of it, I mean, obviously the economy is growing strong. It's a very strong economy, low unemployment rates in most all states. Infrastructure is an area of which I think that Democrats and Republicans can agree on. The most important thing with that infrastructure side is how they're actually going to pay for it. Is it going to be a fuel tax? Is it going to be a way to actually pay for the infrastructure that's needed with our bridges and roads and infrastructure, broadband and other infrastructure that's needed in so many of these rural communities? I don't know how they're going to get through the debt and deficit side of a massive infrastructure, massive, $1 trillion investment in our infrastructure without probably raising the gas tax to be able to do that. The clean energy, that's probably an area that you're starting to see more Republicans come closer to aligning, not totally aligning with the Democrats, but I think there's probably more crossover on clean energy policy than there are most other issues in Congress. A lot of Democrats and Republicans can cross over on that issue. As long as the EPA is not used, name is used in so many of the public policy, I think they could actually probably find some common ground there. Campaign finance reform, lobby reform, Voters' Rights Act. I think all of those are just kind of those feel good. That's a great thing to talk about, but it seems like nothing ever gets done. There's not really any legislation that's really going to be meaningful. That's an area that Democrats and Republicans, I do not see ever being able to be on the same page. When one in power, then they never want to do campaign finance reform, and the other groups, when the other parties in charge, they don't want to do campaign finance reform. So even with a split with the House and the Senate, I don't see anything being done in campaign finance, lobby overhaul. I don't see any of those things changes as we see it. Maybe a lot of talk, maybe some legislation past the House, but obviously not likely to go to the past the Senate or the president actually signing any of that legislation.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big messaging item when you hear Nancy Pelosi talk about the agenda. She seems to mention that one first, kind of like this, this sense of, well, we need to win the voters' trust back before we pass legislation, drain the swamp. We're going to do it, even though the president and Republicans wouldn't do it when they were in charge. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to see. I know they seem like the Democrats in the House are going to lead with that, but it'll be interesting to see how what happens when that runs up against a Republican Senate, if they can get together and decide some of those things. Let's talk a little about some of the specific policy areas. You just talked a little bit about infrastructure, Heath, and on the one hand, it seems like this is where White House and Republicans and Democrats could agree, but they disagree on some key things, as you've talked about. Do you use private funding, or do you use a gas tax to finance infrastructure? And the other question is more of a political one. Do Democrats want to give the president a policy win as he's sort of gearing up for his 2020 reelection campaign? On the one hand, there are certainly some Democrats who are talking about impeaching the president, but on the other hand, do you want to work with him to give him a policy win? How is that going to play out?
Well, Mike, I think you and I both kind of dealt with this while we were in office, that so much of the votes that you cast on the floor end up being 30-second commercial ads running against you. So I think that you're going to see a lot of bills come to the House floor that are what I would consider these gotcha votes. These, how are you going to vote? Are you going to vote with your constituency? How do you vote against particular infrastructure deals? Is there the third-party groups talking about you increase and raising taxes? I mean, so many of these votes are, although I think the parties would like to get them passed, they seem to me always seem to be like they were more about the next election until one party has complete control over the House, Senate, and White House, so they can actually push their agenda forward. I was there, and Mike, you were there where we had it split, and then I was there when the Democrats had all three areas, and it's a much different policies come forth on the House floor when it is divided Congress. It's a lot of the gotcha votes, and I personally think that the biggest problem that we're facing that they have to get in front of is the debt and deficit. I mean, we can't continue down the path that we're currently on. They've got to find a way to get revenues or cut costs. And talking to trillions of dollars in an infrastructure bill makes it difficult. I know the gas tax hasn't been raised since, 93, I think. So it's been a long time since the federal tax has been raised. I may be wrong on that, but I know it's been several years that it's been raised. And so that amount of money that has been put forth into the coffers for infrastructures is not what it should be in order for us to maintain the current infrastructure, the safety of our bridges and roads.
Yeah, and if I'm sure some of our listeners were able to catch some or all of President Trump's news conference from a little bit earlier today. It was a wild news conference, really amazing to watch in a lot of ways. But that was one area that he talked about, hopefully being able to negotiate and strike a deal. This is an area where he thought perhaps there'd be an opportunity to work with Democrats. But of course, in the same breath, he's talking about, the investigations that may be coming and other oversight and challenges and hostility coming from Democrats in the House towards the administration. So really tough to see how that sort of sorts itself out. Let's move on to some other areas. Let's talk about taxes. Of course, Republicans had enacted this, sweeping tax cuts, tax reform in 2017. There were no Democrats who supported it in the House or the Senate. Maybe they can come back in a lame duck session here to do something narrow on tax extenders or some other tax issues, but it doesn't seem like there's any real big desire to do anything big in 2019. I think maybe the biggest thing that Chairman Richie Neal may need to deal with at the Ways and Means Committee is legally getting their hands on President Trump's tax returns, which have been talked about by Democrats a lot. How do you think Ways and Means and their agenda is going to be affected?
Well, Mike, you're exactly right. Trump's tax return has always been an issue, and I think that becomes an issue for the 2020 election. So I think the Ways and Means Committee will be relatively quiet in 19, other than the tax returns. I think that that Richie will probably, I think he will definitely handle it with integrity. It's just what others actually do with the tax returns if it becomes public.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. So pivoting to healthcare, there could seemingly be some room for bipartisanship on efforts to lower prescription drug prices. But again, and as you rightly pointed out earlier, this is an area where you could see Democrats and President Trump finding some common ground and working together to lower drug prices. But again, are Democrats going to want to give the president a win on one of his big issues as you lead into the 2020 election? When it comes to healthcare, it seems like most of the activity may be around Democrats' oversight, not legislating. Is that your read?
Yeah, I think the oversight's once again going to be seeing areas within to make sure that any policies going forward or any legislation moving forward would actually view the Democratic Party's the Obamacare the way it was enacted. I know they all know that there needs to be changes within that policy, but I think they're not willing to give in that those areas needs to be fixed. So once again, Mike, I think you're hitting it nail on the head with so much of this is not going to give the president a win, and the president's not willing to give the Democratic House a win.
So on the issue of trade, this is something that the president has talked a lot about. It's been a real topic he's been very, very active on. And some folks say talked and acted a little bit more like a Democrat than perhaps a Republican in terms of tariffs and protectionism and trying to renegotiate trade deals more favorably for American interests. Democrats, I know I talked to some Democrats who kind of like the president's overall trade and tariff policy, but they criticize it as being, chaotic or undisciplined. Is there, in particular, the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement, the renegotiated NAFTA, so to speak? You think there's a chance that Democrats would find a way to support that? Democrats in the House would find a way to support that now that they're going to be in charge?
Yeah, I think so often you look at trade agreements as how the unions view those agreements. Is it a betterment for the unions within the United States? Is it better for them? Is it for jobs? I know Steny Hoyer has been very outspoken about his slogan he's had for quite some time. It's "Make it in America," about creating the jobs in the U.S. and bringing so much of our jobs that had been sent over seas or from China and or the Mexico-Canadian borders, bringing those jobs back to the U.S. So there may be an opportunity there moving forward on some trade agreements.
Let's talk about energy. This is something something you certainly know something about. You mentioned the EPA. You talked about Democrats possibly sort of going into overdrive on investigating the EPA and the Interior Department and the president's deregulatory agenda. Really tough in my mind to see much bipartisanship on the topic of energy and the environment. What do you think?
I think you're right. I think that so much of our energy independence and global is going to it's just completely at odds. You know, that the Republicans tend to have a little bit more leaning on the petroleum, natural gas area, and then Democrats are more with renewable energy, solar, wind power. And I just don't think that that's a lot of the common ground. You know, coming from that industry, we've got our challenges ahead of us moving forward. And I think that the biggest challenge that's facing is actually on the nuclear side, with the reauthorization of so many of these nuclear facilities throughout the United States. You know, are they going to be reauthorized? Are they going to have to start moving to other alternative energies, or bring back coal in some instances where there's a coal fire plant very close to a nuclear facility? I think that's going to be the challenges, not only for both parties and the administration, but it's really going to be a challenge for so many of the utility companies moving forward, is what they will do with their nuclear facilities they have that are facing reauthorization.
So talking about the Financial Services Committee and the financial services agenda, here's one that should be pretty interesting. Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Maxine Waters from California, has been a frequent target of criticism from very pointed and personal criticism from the president. She is going to be taken over as the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. She is, known for, pushing an agenda of consumer protection and on housing issues, going after big banks. She's been critical of the Trump administration for undermining the Dodd-Frank law. Interestingly, I mentioned Patrick McHenry before, who may be running for a leadership position. If he decides not to do that, or if that doesn't work out, he may take the ranking member, top Republican position on the Financial Services Committee, and it will be interesting to see what kind of a working relationship he and Maxine Waters could work out on perhaps some bipartisan issues. But what's your sense for how a chairwoman Maxine Waters would run financial services?
Well, certainly, Mike, if Patrick McHenry becomes a ranking member and Maxine Waters continues to hold her, be the chairwoman of the committee, then the Finance Committee, that would be a well worth getting a ticket to see a lot of those hearings. I think you would see a lot of a disagreement. I can't imagine them ever agreeing on absolutely anything, the two of them. So, that would be I think you're going to find just complete stalemate in that committee. I think you're going to see a lot of disagreeing, fireworks. Nothing's going to come out of that committee that is going to be in a bipartisan way. I just cannot see those individuals actually working together on anything that would leave the committee to go to the House. That would be meaningful legislation.
Let's turn to the area of technology and communications. Some folks have said that if there's one area of bipartisanship in Washington right now, it's how both parties view social media companies and platforms. Even President Trump has even talked about potential antitrust action against Facebook and Google and Apple and Twitter. There is also some bipartisan interest in speeding up deployment of a 5G build out around the country. Do you think that there's something that the Republicans and Democrats and the administration can come together on relating to technology or data privacy or cyber?
Yeah, they're probably the biggest areas, the data privacy and the individual privacy on so many of the social media areas. That's probably an area that I think they can probably come up with some good, meaningful legislation that could have some consumer protections around that. The other would obviously be almost a part of the infrastructure, the 5G, be able to build that out throughout the U.S. That could be a part of an infrastructure project in a much larger infrastructure bill coming in 19.
So we've touched briefly on a bunch of different policy areas, and obviously we encourage folks who are interested in talking more specifically about any of these issues to be in touch with us, because we'd be delighted to work with you more on those things. But now, what's going to happen? You know, we've talked about some of our best guesses in some of these specific areas, but let's talk first just briefly about the lame duck, because between now and the end of the year, there's some things that need to get done, and will be interesting to see what gets done. And then let's talk a little bit about the next Congress as well. But first of all, for the lame duck, 60% of the government is funded. The appropriations bills were done, and the government is funded through the next fiscal year. So there's some of the government that still needs to be funded. They're funded through the first week of December, and the Department of Homeland Security is one of those areas that still needs to have a deal worked out sometime between now and the end of the year. And that, of course, is where the president wants to see his funding for the wall. So one of the big questions in the lame duck is going to be, how do Democrats position themselves as either being cooperative or not cooperative during the lame duck session, and how much of this lame duck agenda do they want to punt into next year when they're in control of the House of Representatives? And one of the questions the president is going to have to answer is, does he want to shut down the government or encourage shutting down of the government over the issue of wall funding? And who knows, knowing this president, he may well want to do that. He may feel like that's a good political fight for him, particularly after Republicans lost their majority in the House of Representatives. That's probably the biggest issue that will dominate the lame duck session, and there'll be some other issues, as we've said, perhaps some tax extenders. Obviously, the medical device tax and other topics are going to be discussed a good bit. But I think the wall funding may well dominate the lame duck session. And then looking at next year, really for me, as we look at a divided Congress, it just means it's going to be really tough to get a lot done. You know, frankly, I think President Trump is going to love running for re-election against a Democratic House. It's given him a foil. It's given him some kind of an opponent, an enemy. Sometimes a word he uses. Sometimes, you know, we could end up seeing some real trench warfare between the parties. There's, as we've talked about, not a lot of areas of bipartisan agreement. There's a couple of must-pass vehicles next year, a couple of things that have to happen, and it'll be interesting to see how they happen. One is the raising of the debt ceiling in March, so it'll be very interesting to see how Democrats in the House and Republicans in the Senate and the President get together to figure that out. And it'll be very interesting to see what sort of horse trading, what sort of deals have to be cut to pass that. As we've seen, that is a real opportunity for brinksmanship. We've seen in the past, so we may well see that as the sort of first opportunity for a deal and a first opportunity for a big fight between the leaders of divided government. And then the next sort of must-pass vehicle next year will be dealing with the budget caps. So by October 1st, the sequestration budget caps will snap back into effect if there is not a deal for further funding of the government and further revoking of the sequestration budget cap. So it's going to be very interesting. At least those two things are going to need to happen, and it's going to be very interesting to see how Republicans and Democrats and House and Senate and administration get together. It was interesting, you know, the president talked in his news conference today about how, you know, he wants to work with Democrats, and he thinks there'll be opportunities, and he wants to do his best to work with Democrats, but he also took a combative tone when he talked about the fact that you know, that Democrats in the House may be investigating him and providing some aggressive oversight. So that will be an opportunity for real battles. I have to, since we're live here, I need to mention that I'm handed a note that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has resigned and the president has announced that the acting attorney general will be Matthew Whitaker, who has been Sessions' chief of staff over at the Department of Justice. So we certainly, that was certainly widely expected. I would expect that there will be additional turnover, folks leaving the administration, folks leaving the White House. It's fairly standard after midterm elections, but I think it certainly is to be expected in a pretty tumultuous administration as this one has been. So anyway, circling back to opportunities for bipartisanship and opportunities for gridlock, Heath, do you want to comment on any of that?
Certainly gridlocks, I think, in the future for the House and the presidency. Going forward from the 2020, I think it's actually for the president himself. I think having Democrats in charge of the House is a place to lay blame when things aren't done. So I think it actually plays in the favor of the president having the Democrats, so he can name Nancy Pelosi as the reason why things aren't getting done in Washington, D.C. He's really, really good at, placing that blame, and it's really difficult. He has a pulpit every single day, and whether it be on Twitter or his ability to get in the news, he certainly is able to bring his message forward much faster than most presidents I have ever seen. And with that, I think it becomes a gridlock in Washington, D.C., and just a battle for 2020.
Yeah, I think that's right. We say on our slide here, the 2020 campaign begins today, and it really does. In fact, a lot of folks think it began before today, but it technically certainly begins today. We're going to get to some questions now, and one question we got is if it's possible to receive a copy of the slides from this presentation. It certainly is. Anyone who's registered should receive a follow-up email from us with some of the slides on there. So, and if you have any questions about that, or if you haven't received that, feel free to follow up with us. We'd be happy to get you a copy of the slides. Some other questions we have. Let's see. Is raising the gas tax a possibility to fund infrastructure? I think that's very, very unlikely. I certainly invite Heath to weigh in on this as well. But I know Chuck Schumer has been opposed to that. I think a lot of Republicans are opposed to raising the gas tax to fund infrastructure. Of course, it's some folks make the argument that as cars become more and more fuel efficient, that's a not as effective tool to fund infrastructure. Others have proposed some sort of a fee or tax on miles traveled. I think that's one of the things that would vex a bipartisan agreement on infrastructure is how to fund it, and that's something that's that where there has not been a consensus that has been formed yet on that. Heath, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that as well.
I totally agree, Mike. I mean, the funding side of the infrastructure bill going forward would have to be, that'll be the point of contention. I will say this, if I think in the House for sure, I think the Democrats are probably in a situation that they're probably more likely to put an infrastructure bill out. I remember so often they would say for every dollar spent in infrastructure, it creates $7 of off spend of spending. So I know that that from years past, so it may not be a situation where they actually, and that's, as a citizen now, not being in, that's my concern, that they continue to rack up debt and deficit and not finding ways to actually pay for the bills going forward. We always had the Blue Dogs' motto was pay as you go, and for every dollar you spend, you must have a way to save a dollar. And I just don't see, typically Democrats haven't been one for saving, and recently the Republicans haven't been one for cutting. And it's been a lot of spending over the last really 12, 16 years that we've got to get under control. So there could be a point that they get legislation done based upon infrastructure, but I'd really like to see them fund it.
Moving on to another question, what specific proposals might Trump and the Democrats find agreement on with regard to drug prices? This is something, certainly it's been in the news a lot. The president talks about drug prices a lot, as a number of Democrats do as well. A lot of folks talking about drug prices. I think there's a couple of areas, certainly that Democrats and the president have both talked about as being supportive of. One is overturning the non-interference clause for government negotiation for drug prices in government programs. And then the second one, of course, is importation, the so-called importation, where drugs from other countries which are less expensive because of the way other countries decide on pricing of those drugs, importing those lower cost, lower priced drugs into the United States to get around what may be higher prices here in the U.S. The real question, I think, is will with those proposals or anything else, is will the out-of-pocket costs for patients actually go down? Of course, the way that we pay for drugs and the drug pricing arrangement in the U.S. is very, very complicated. It's different for everybody because of insurance and various government programs. So at the end of the day, I think what the president and anyone who's concerned about drug prices is mostly concerned about is what are people paying out of pocket, and what is the sort of the pain that they're feeling as they seek to afford to pay for their medicine. It's been these issues have been a real kind of a red line for the pharmaceutical industry and the biotechnology industry. But that's, there's certainly accelerated risk there now for folks in the industry who are opposed to these types of policies. Another item of concern, I think, for the industry would be that Chuck Grassley is slated to take over chairmanship of the Finance Committee in the Senate. He has not been a friend to the industry in many ways. He's been a real critic of the industry in many ways. So with him as chairman of the principal, certainly one of the principal drug pricing committees in the Senate, is another cause of concern for folks in the industry. Leader McConnell, of course, may be the best friend that the industry has right now in Washington, D.C., because he is someone who's been supportive of the industry and has a lot to say with what works its way through the Senate. So certainly elevated risk there for folks in industry who are concerned about that potential area of bipartisan agreement on drug pricing. With that, we are going to wrap up. We are out of time. We want to thank everybody who's been a participant. I want to thank especially my friend and colleague Heath Shuler for being a part of this presentation and offering so many insights from his Democratic perspective, which is going to be very, very important, obviously, as we get into legislating and the regulatory world next year here in Washington. If you have any other questions, any follow-up that you'd like to talk with us about here at Baker Hostetler, we would be delighted to talk with you about those. And we hope you found this bipartisan presentation valuable as you're making your business decisions next year based on how Congress may act on any of these policies. Again, I'm former Congressman Mike Ferguson of Baker Hostetler. I lead our federal policy team, where we provide clients with comprehensive government affairs and public policy consulting services. Really, again, pleased that my colleague and former Congressman Heath Shuler, who's a senior advisor here with us at Baker Hostetler, was on here again. Heath, thanks again for your partnership and for your great insights today.
Thank you, Mike. Great job. Greatly appreciate you.
And again, I invite anybody, if you have any questions, reach out to us here in the Washington office at 202-861-1500. Again, that's 202-861-1500. Thanks again for joining us for another of our series of Baker Hostetler policy webinars. We'll be contacting you soon about our next upcoming webinar. Until then, good afternoon from the nation's capital.